Welcome back, dear time travelers, to another journey into the past, one that might just lull you into the most peaceful sleep you've had in weeks. Or, if you're already tucked in, consider this your permission to drift away at any moment. No judgment here. In fact, that's precisely the point. Tonight, we're venturing into the medieval Islamic world, a civilization so structured around faith that even your bathroom breaks would require theological consideration. I'm only slightly exaggerating. Before you click away thinking this will be a lecture, relax. We're here to explore, not to convert or condemn, but to understand what daily life felt like when prayer bells shaped your schedule more rigidly than any modern alarm clock ever could. Imagine, if you will, a world where time itself bends around worship, where the sun's position determines not just your lunch break, but your entire relationship with the divine, where fasting isn't a trendy health hack, but a communal experience that reshapes society for an entire month, where knowledge and faith aren't at odds but dance together in magnificent libraries that would make our modern institutions weep with envy. The irony, of course, is that we think we're busy. We complain about our schedules, our obligations, our inability to find time for ourselves. And yet the people we're about to meet would look at our day and laugh, kindly, of course, because hospitality was serious business, but laugh nonetheless. They prayed 5 times daily at specific times, fasted for a month straight, memorized texts that would fill entire bookshelves, and still managed to create one of history's greatest intellectual golden ages. Show-offs. So before we begin, do me a favor. If you're enjoying these historical escapes into sleep, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment about which era you'd like us to explore next, perhaps medieval Japan, or Viking Scandinavia, or the Byzantine Empire. And if you feel particularly generous, hit that like button. It helps us reach more insomniacs and history enthusiasts who desperately need both education and rest. Now, settle in, adjust your pillows, feel the weight of your blankets. In a moment, we'll step back roughly 1,000 years to the streets of Baghdad, Cairo, or Cordoba, though really, the experience we're about to describe could happen in any major Islamic city of the medieval period. The details shift, but the rhythm remains the same. A rhythm you absolutely, positively wouldn't last a day trying to maintain. Let's find out why. It begins before dawn, always before dawn. You're asleep, deeply, beautifully asleep in a way that modern humans, with their phones buzzing and their minds racing with tomorrow's meetings, can only dream of achieving. Except, wait, you're not asleep anymore, because from the minaret above, a voice rises into the darkness, the adhan, the call to prayer, performed by the muezzin, whose job requires him to have both a strong voice and an even stronger sense of duty. Since he's been up for at least an hour already, preparing, Allahu Akbar, he calls. God is greatest, over and over, a pattern of phrases you've known since childhood, each word arriving at the pre-dawn darkness like a gentle but insistent knock on the door of your consciousness. The time for this prayer, Fajr, is calculated with remarkable precision. Not by checking your phone, obviously, but by a complex understanding of celestial movements that would impress any astronomer. The prayer must begin when the first thread of light appears on the horizon, and end before sunrise. This window, in most places and seasons, gives you roughly an hour, maybe 90 minutes if you're lucky. Here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting, I mean exhausting. You cannot simply roll over and promise yourself you'll pray later. That's not how this works. The prayer is time-specific. Miss the window, and technically you've missed the obligation, though you can make it up with a Qeda prayer later. But that's not ideal. That's failure, in a sense. And in a society where your neighbors definitely notice who shows up to the mosque and who doesn't, failure has social consequences. So you rise. Your body protests naturally because it's still dark, and evolutionarily speaking, humans are meant to be asleep when it's dark. But spiritual evolution apparently runs on a different clock. Before you can even think about prayer, there's the matter of wudu, ritual ablution. This isn't a quick splash of water on your face. This is a specific ordered sequence of washing that must be performed correctly, or the prayer won't count. Picture this. You stumble to wherever water is available. If you're fortunate enough to live in a larger home, you might have a small basin or courtyard fountain. If you're among the vast majority, and statistically you probably are, you're heading to a communal water source or working with a small clay jar of water you filled the night before, hoping it would be enough. The process follows a precise order that you've internalized through years of repetition. Intention stated in your heart. Hands washed 3 times, mouth rinsed 3 times, nose cleaned 3 times, face washed, arms up to the elbows, head wiped, ears cleaned, feet washed up to the ankles. Each action is performed 3 times, except for the head, which is once. Get the order wrong, and you start over. Now imagine doing this in winter. The water is cold, genuinely cold, the kind that makes your fingers ache and your breath catch. There's no hot water tap, no heated bathroom. You're washing in the darkness before dawn, and the water feels like it's been imported directly from a mountain stream, which, depending on your city's aqueduct system, it might have been. The irony is almost painful. Modern humans complain endlessly about morning routines, but we do so while standing in heated rooms, using hot water, with electric lights blazing. Our medieval Muslim friend is performing meticulous ritual cleaning in cold darkness because spiritual purity cannot wait for comfort. Now, properly cleaned, you orient yourself toward Mecca. This direction, the Qibla, is something every building is constructed with in mind. Mosques have a niche, a mihrab, indicating it. Homes have marks or features that show it. If you're traveling or unsure, you consult the sun, the stars, or someone with knowledge. The prayer itself is a marvel of physical and spiritual choreography. You stand, you bow, you prostrate, you sit, you prostrate again. Each position held for specific phrases recited in Arabic, even if Arabic isn't your native language, and for most Muslims throughout history it wasn't. You've memorized these prayers phonetically. The opening Surah Al-Fatiha is non-negotiable. You must know it to pray. The physical aspect alone would challenge most modern people. The standing is fine. The bowing, ruku, requires you to bend at the hips, keeping your back straight, hands on knees, a position that's surprisingly tiring to hold while reciting phrases. Then comes the prostration, sujud, where your forehead, nose, palms, knees, and toes all touch the ground. You're essentially folding yourself into a posture of complete submission. You do this sequence multiple times. Fajr prayer consists of 2 rak'ahs, 2 cycles of this standing, bowing, prostrating sequence. If you're praying the additional recommended prayers, the sunnah prayers, you might do 4 cycles total. Each cycle takes several minutes. Your knees, if they're anything like most people's knees after age 30, are already filing complaints. But here's what makes it somewhat bearable. even beautiful in its own way. You're not alone. Even if you're praying at home, you know that across the city, across the entire Islamic world, millions are doing exactly this at exactly this time. There's a profound solidarity in synchronized worship. The atomized loneliness of modern spiritual practice simply doesn't exist here. Dawn prayer complete, you face a choice. If you're wealthy or scholarly, you might return to bed for a few hours. But if you're a craftsman, a merchant, a farmer, or anyone whose livelihood depends on labor, which is most people, returning to sleep is a luxury you cannot afford. The markets open early. Bread must be baked in time for breakfast. Animals need tending. Workshops need preparing. The rhythm of economic life doesn't pause for spiritual obligations. Rather, it weaves around them, accommodating them because it must. You might grab a quick breakfast, bread, perhaps some cheese, dates if they're in season and you can afford them, water or milk. Tea exists. Coffee is beginning to appear in certain regions during certain centuries, but caffeine culture as we know it is largely absent. You're facing this day on pure discipline and perhaps the momentum of habit. The sun rises fully. Light spills across the city, golden and clean in a way that modern urban dwellers, with their light pollution and smog, can barely imagine. The city comes alive with sound, merchants calling their wares, animals protesting their burdens, children playing, artisans at work. The air fills with smells, baking bread, animal dung, spices from the market, wood smoke, human sweat perfumes from the wealthy quarters. And in the back of your mind, always, is the awareness of time passing. Because this isn't your only prayer today. This is merely the first. Zuhr prayer arrives when the sun passes its zenith. The exact time varies by season and location, but typically falls in the early to mid-afternoon. In summer, this means the hottest part of the day. Let's linger on what that means. Medieval Islamic civilization flourished across a geographical band that includes some of the hottest regions on Earth: Arabia, North Africa, Andalusia, Persia, and beyond. Air conditioning won't be invented for centuries. Fans exist, but they're manual labor. Someone else's manual labor, meaning they're a luxury item. When midday prayer arrives, you stop whatever you're doing. If you're a merchant, you close your stall or leave it in the hands of a trusted assistant. If you're a craftsman, you set down your tools. If you're a farmer, you walk back from the fields. And you perform wudu again, because the morning's ablution doesn't carry forward if you've used the bathroom, slept, or done anything that breaks wudu, which includes a surprising number of bodily functions our modern sensibilities prefer not to dwell on. The water, now, is warm from sitting in the sun. This should be pleasant, except that warm water doesn't cool you down when you're already overheated. You wash mechanically, precisely, the movements so familiar that your mind can wander even as your hands follow the ritual path. Zuhr consists of 4 rakahs, double the morning prayer. More standing, more bowing, more prostrating. If you're praying in the mosque, which is strongly encouraged for men, you're surrounded by other bodies, other breath, other heat. The mosque is cooler than outside, certainly, with its thick walls and thoughtful architecture. But it's still warm. Sweat traces lines down your spine. Your knees protest the repeated prostrations. The prayer ends. You return to work. The day continues. Asr prayer arrives in the late afternoon, when shadows lengthen to approximately twice the length of objects. This is another 4 rakahs. By now, you're tired. Your body aches from labor. Your mind is occupied with work concerns, family matters, the thousand mundane anxieties that constitute human existence. But the prayer doesn't care about your fatigue. The prayer is scheduled, mandatory, non-negotiable. You wash again. You pray again. You return to your activities again. Maghrib prayer comes immediately after sunset. This one, at least, is only 3 rak'ahs, a small mercy. The day's work is ending. You head home or to the mosque, depending on your habits and social position. The sky fades through shades of purple and blue. The city's character changes as darkness arrives. Sounds soften, different smells emerge. The temperature drops if you're fortunate. But you're not done yet. Isha, the night prayer, arrives after the last light has faded from the western horizon. Another 4 rak'ahs. By now, you've prayed 17 rak'ahs if you're doing only the obligatory prayers. If you've included the recommended sunnah prayers, you're well over 20. Each rak'ah involves multiple cycles of standing, bowing, and prostrating. Let's do the math that medieval Muslims didn't need to do because it was simply life. You've woken before dawn, performed ritual washing at least 5 times, engaged in perhaps 30 minutes to an hour of physical prayer movements, all while maintaining your regular work and life obligations. Your knees have bent and straightened dozens of times. Your forehead has touched the ground dozens of times. You've recited memorized Arabic phrases hundreds of times. And tomorrow, you'll do it again. And the day after. And the day after that. For your entire life. Now, imagine all of this, but add one more element. Ramadan. For 1 month each year, a lunar month, meaning it shifts through the solar calendar, sometimes landing in summer, sometimes winter, you fast from dawn to dusk. No food. No water, no intimate relations with your spouse. From the moment the first thread of light appears until the sun sets completely, you abstain. In winter, this might be manageable. The days are shorter, the temperatures cooler. But when Ramadan falls in summer, as it did periodically throughout medieval Islamic history, and still does today, you're facing 14, 15, 16 hours of fasting in intense heat. Picture a summer day in Baghdad or Cairo. You wake for Fajr prayer before dawn and eat a pre-dawn meal, suhoor. You eat strategically. Foods that digest slowly, plenty of water, dates for quick energy. Then the sun rises, and you don't eat or drink again until sunset. You still work. The economy doesn't pause for Ramadan. If you're a laborer, you're lifting, carrying, building, plowing, all without water, in heat that routinely exceeds 90 or even 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Your tongue grows thick in your mouth. Your head pounds. Your stomach cramps from emptiness. Then eventually goes numb. The 5 daily prayers continue, of course. Wudu becomes particularly cruel because you're putting water on your skin, but cannot drink it. You smell it. You feel its coolness. But consuming even a single drop breaks your fast. Yet there's something remarkable that happens during Ramadan. Something that makes it bearable, even meaningful. The entire community is suffering together. The wealthy merchant and the poor laborer both have empty stomachs. The scholar and the illiterate both have dry mouths. There's a leveling effect, a reminder that all humans share basic needs and vulnerabilities. When sunset finally arrives and the adhan for Maghrib sounds, the breaking of the fast, iftar, becomes a moment of profound relief and gratitude. Traditionally, you break your fast with dates and water, following the Prophet's example. Even this simple combination tastes extraordinary after hours of deprivation. Then comes a proper meal, often shared with family and community. The mosques provide free iftar for those who cannot afford it. Strangers invite strangers to share their food. After Maghrib and after eating, there's an additional prayer specific to Ramadan, Tarawih. This can involve 20 or more rak'ahs, sometimes with significant portions of Quran recited. It can last an hour or more. You do this on an empty stomach, or rather, a recently filled stomach that's been empty all day and is now somewhat confused about what's happening. Then, you sleep briefly before waking for suhoor, the pre-dawn meal, and the cycle begins again. For an entire month. Beyond the structured prayers and fasting, there are countless smaller religious obligations and recommendations that permeate daily life in ways modern secular existence simply doesn't comprehend. There are specific prayers for specific occasions. Before eating, after eating, entering the bathroom, leaving home, entering home, seeing something beautiful, hearing bad news, sneezing, hearing someone sneeze. There are recommended phrases for greeting people, for saying goodbye, for beginning any task. You're encouraged to read or recite Quran regularly. If you're literate, which you might not be, you're expected to read it correctly, with proper pronunciation and recitation rules that are surprisingly complex. If you're not literate, you're expected to memorize portions of it through hearing. There are rules about cleanliness that extend far beyond wudu. Regular bathing, ghusl, is required after certain activities. Your clothes must be clean for prayer. You need to be aware of whether a dog has licked something, because that requires special cleaning. You need to know which hand to use for eating, right, and which for bathroom purposes, left. And mixing these up is considered deeply inappropriate. Dietary laws govern what you can eat. No pork, obviously. No alcohol. Meat must be slaughtered according to specific Islamic rules, halal, or it's forbidden. If you're traveling or in a mixed city, you need to be constantly aware of whether your food meets these requirements. There are social obligations wrapped in religious language. Charity isn't just encouraged, it's mandatory through zakat, an annual wealth tax that goes to the poor. Hospitality isn't just nice, it's a religious duty. Honesty in business transactions isn't just ethical, it's worship. And underlying all of this is the constant awareness of accountability. Every action, every word, every thought is being recorded by angels, specifically assigned to you for this purpose. The angel on your right shoulder records good deeds. The one on your left records sins. At death, you'll face judgment based on this record. Modern humans, especially those from secular backgrounds, cannot comprehend what it feels like to live with this level of religious structure and accountability. We might have internalized guilt or anxiety, sure, but not this specific, codified, community-reinforced system of divine surveillance and expectation. Here's where the irony becomes almost overwhelming. Despite all these obligations, despite this exhausting structure, the medieval Islamic legal tradition developed extensive concepts of mercy and accommodation. Sick? You can pray sitting, or lying down if necessary. Traveling? You can shorten and combine prayers. Elderly? There are allowances. Women menstruating? They're exempt from prayer during that time. Unable to fast for legitimate health reasons? You can make up the days later, or feed a poor person for each day missed, or be entirely exempt if the condition is permanent. The jurists, the fuqaha, spent enormous intellectual energy working out exactly when these allowances applied, how much hardship constituted a valid reason for accommodation, how to balance obligation with mercy. This wasn't legalistic nitpicking. This was a recognition that humans are fallible, finite, prone to weakness. But here's the catch. To receive mercy, you had to be genuinely unable, not merely unwilling. A headache isn't sufficient reason to skip a prayer. Being tired isn't sufficient reason to break your fast. The bar for exemption is high enough that most people, most of the time, were expected to fulfill the obligations. And so they did. For centuries, millions of people living lives of profound religious discipline, managing to also build civilizations, create art, advance science, raise families, experience joy and sorrow and all the textures of human existence, all while praying 5 times daily, fasting 1 month yearly, and organizing their entire lives around their relationship with the divine. So here we are, back to the original claim, you wouldn't last a day. And it's true, isn't it? Be honest with yourself. Could you wake before dawn every single day for prayer? Could you interrupt your work 5 times daily? Could you fast for 16 hours in summer heat while still fulfilling your obligations? Could you memorize prayers in a foreign language? Could you perform the physical prostrations dozens of times daily well into old age? More than the physical challenge, could you maintain the mental framework, the constant awareness of divine presence, the internalization of rules governing everything from bathroom habits to business transactions, the community surveillance ensuring your compliance, the genuine belief that angels are recording your every deed? Most of us cannot even maintain a simple daily meditation practice or exercise routine for more than a few weeks. We struggle to put our phones down for an hour. We find 30 minutes of yoga challenging. We complain about having to go to the DMV once every few years. The medieval Muslim world asked for and received far more from its adherents than we can easily comprehend from our comfortable, climate-controlled, religiously optional modern existence. Yet somehow, understanding this makes their achievements even more remarkable. The scholars who revolutionized mathematics were also praying 5 times daily. The physicians who advanced medical knowledge were also fasting every Ramadan. The poets who created enduring literature were also performing ablutions in cold water before dawn. They managed to be fully human, productive, creative, loving, ambitious, petty, jealous, kind, cruel, all of it, within this structure of religious obligation that we find exhausting to even contemplate. As you lie here, comfortable in your bed, with no morning prayer awaiting you, with no fast to maintain, with no ritual washing to perform, perhaps you can appreciate the softness of your own moment, the freedom of your schedule, the absence of divine accounting, or perhaps you might wonder what it provided them, this structure, whether there was something in the rhythm, the community, the shared struggle, that we've lost in our liberation from religious routine. But that's a question for another time, perhaps when you're less drowsy. For now, rest. Let your mind drift. Because unlike our friends in medieval Baghdad, you have nowhere you need to be before dawn. Lucky you. Now that you've survived, or more accurately, completely failed to survive, a single day in the life of an ordinary believer, let's turn our attention to someone who not only survived, but thrived within this system of relentless religious structure. Someone who managed to become one of history's most influential philosophers, physicians, and polymaths while still waking up before dawn for prayer. Someone whose very existence makes the rest of us look embarrassingly lazy. His full name was Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Abd Allah ibn al-Hassan ibn Ali ibn Sina, which medieval Europeans, who couldn't be bothered with Arabic naming conventions, shortened to Avicenna. He was born around 980 CE in a village near Bukhara in what is now Uzbekistan, and he died in 1037 CE in Hamadan, in modern-day Iran. In between these dates, he somehow found time to write approximately 450 works, become the most famous physician in the world, revolutionize philosophy, serve as a court physician and political advisor, and yes, maintain his 5 daily prayers and annual Ramadan fasts. The overachiever of the medieval Islamic world, in other words. The kind of person who makes you feel guilty about spending 3 hours scrolling through social media. But before we roll our eyes too hard at his accomplishments, let's understand what it actually meant to live his life, because the reality is far more textured than the simple narrative of genius does genius things. Avicenna's life was a peculiar combination of profound intellectual achievement and constant instability, of religious devotion and worldly ambition, of scholarly isolation and political intrigue. He was, in short, fully human, which somehow makes his achievements even more irritating for those of us who struggle to finish a single book. The story begins, as so many stories of medieval Islamic scholars do, with a precocious childhood that would make modern helicopter parents weep with envy. Avicenna's father was a government official under the Samanid dynasty, which ruled parts of Central Asia and Iran during this period. The family was well off, not fabulously wealthy, but comfortable enough to afford education for their exceptionally bright son. This detail matters because genius, despite our romantic notions, rarely flourishes in poverty. It requires resources, books, teachers, time freed from survival labor. Young Avicenna, let's call him Ibn Sina, which is more authentic, showed intellectual gifts early. By age 10, he had memorized the entire Quran. Let me pause here so you can appreciate what that means. The Quran contains approximately 77,000 words in Arabic, arranged in 114 chapters of varying length. Memorizing it requires not just retention, but understanding the proper recitation rules, the pronunciation, the rhythm. Many Muslims spend years, even decades, working toward this goal. Ibn Sina did it by age 10, while simultaneously studying Arabic grammar, literature, and basic Islamic jurisprudence. His father, recognizing his son's abilities, brought in a series of tutors. There was a teacher of Indian arithmetic. The decimal system that would eventually revolutionize European mathematics was already well established in the Islamic world. There was instruction in algebra, a field whose very name comes from the Arabic al-Jabur. There was geometry from Euclid, whose works were preserved and studied in Arabic when much of Europe had forgotten them. There was logic, philosophy, and medicine. By age 16, Ibn Sina had completed what we might consider the equivalent of a doctoral education. He was studying and treating patients, reading advanced philosophical texts, and corresponding with other scholars. At 16, an age when most modern humans are struggling with basic algebra and the social dynamics of high school. The irony here is almost painful. We live in an era of unprecedented access to information. The entirety of human knowledge is available on devices we carry in our pockets, yet our attention spans have atrophied to the point where reading a long article feels like labor. Medieval scholars like Ibn Sina, with access to a tiny fraction of the resources we have, somehow achieved depths of learning that shame our superficial browsing culture. But let's not idealize him too much. Ibn Sina's life wasn't a smooth trajectory of intellectual triumph. It was messy, complicated, shaped by political forces beyond his control, and marked by choices that reveal a man navigating between principle and pragmatism. When Ibn Sina was about 18, the Samanid ruler of Bukhara, Nuh ibn Mansur, fell seriously ill. The court physicians were stumped. Someone suggested calling in the brilliant young scholar who had been making a name for himself. Ibn Sina arrived, examined the ruler, diagnosed the problem, prescribed treatment, and apparently saved his life. We don't know the details of the illness or the treatment, which is frustrating for those of us who enjoy concrete details, but the outcome was clear. The grateful ruler granted Ibn Sina access to the royal library. This moment changed everything. The royal library at Bukhara was legendary, containing texts from across the Islamic world and beyond, Greek philosophy translated into Arabic, Persian scientific treatises, Indian mathematical works, medical texts from Alexandria. For a scholar like Ibn Sina, this was paradise. He later wrote that he read so voraciously during this period that sleep became an inconvenience he begrudgingly accommodated only when absolutely necessary. Imagine that lifestyle for a moment. You're 18, 19, 20 years old. You have access to the greatest library in the region. You're reading everything: philosophy, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, theology. You're cross-referencing texts, finding contradictions, developing your own theories. You're taking notes, writing commentaries, beginning work on your own original treatises. And you're doing all of this while maintaining the 5 daily prayers, the fasting, the social obligations of your position. The discipline required is staggering. Not just intellectual discipline, though that's impressive enough, but time management that would make modern productivity gurus weep. Ibn Sina must have structured every hour, planned every day, maximized every moment of cognitive freshness. And he did this without caffeine pills, without artificial lighting that allowed work at all hours, without any of the stimulants and supports modern students rely on. Of course, there was one stimulant he apparently did use: wine. Despite Islam's clear prohibition on alcohol, Ibn Sina was known to enjoy wine, particularly later in life. This detail appears in historical sources, including criticisms from more religiously strict contemporaries. It's a reminder that even the greatest scholars of the Islamic Golden Age were human, capable of rationalizing their way around inconvenient rules, struggling with the gap between spiritual ideals and physical desires. The wine-drinking philosopher-physician, praying 5 times daily while nursing a hangover. The contradictions are almost beautiful, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Ibn Sina's comfortable early years didn't last. In 999 CE, when he was about 19, the Samanid dynasty collapsed under pressure from Turkic military forces. The political stability that had allowed scholarly pursuits evaporated. Libraries were no longer guaranteed safe havens. Patronage dried up. The young scholar suddenly found himself in a world where survival required more than intellectual brilliance. What followed were years of wandering, court-hopping, and political maneuvering that would characterize much of Ibn Sina's adult life. He moved from city to city across Persia, seeking patrons who would support his work. He served various rulers as a physician, as an advisor, as a courtier. Some of these relationships lasted years, others mere months, before political winds shifted and Ibn Sina had to flee to avoid being caught in the wrong faction's fall from grace. This period of his life reveals something important about medieval Islamic intellectual culture. Knowledge was valuable, but it wasn't enough on its own. Scholars needed patronage, which meant navigating court politics, managing relationships with powerful people who could be generous one moment and dangerous the next, balancing intellectual independence with pragmatic loyalty. Ibn Sina was good at this game, but not exceptional. He made allies and enemies. He impressed some rulers and annoyed others. He was imprisoned at least once, possibly more times depending on which historical sources you trust. He escaped danger repeatedly, sometimes through his own cleverness, sometimes through sheer luck, sometimes through the intervention of friends and students. Through all of this instability, he continued writing. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his life. Not the genius, which was innate, but the persistence, despite circumstances that would justify giving up. When he was in prison, he wrote. When he was fleeing from one city to another, he wrote. When he was serving in government positions that surely demanded significant time and energy, he wrote. His magnum opus, The Canon of Medicine, Al-Qanun fi al-Tib in Arabic, was written over many years, in different cities, under different patrons, during both stable and unstable periods of his life. The work synthesized all known medical knowledge of the time: Greek medical theory from Hippocrates and Galen, Indian medical practices, Persian traditions, Arabic innovations, and Ibn Sina's own clinical observations and theoretical developments. The canon organized this vast body of knowledge systematically, presenting medicine not as a collection of unrelated remedies, but as a coherent science based on understanding the body's structure and function. It discussed anatomy, physiology, disease classification, diagnostics, treatment protocols, drug preparation, surgery, and prognosis. It ran to over 1 million words across 5 books. Let me emphasize that number: over 1 million words. Written by hand, without word processors, without cut and paste, without any of the tools we consider essential for writing. Every word carefully inscribed, every diagram carefully drawn, every revision requiring rewriting entire sections. And this was just one of his works. Ibn Sina also wrote the Book of Healing, Kitab al-Shifa, which, despite its title, wasn't about medicine, but rather a comprehensive philosophical encyclopedia covering logic, natural sciences, mathematics, and metaphysics. This work ran to approximately 350,000 words. He wrote commentaries on Aristotle, original philosophical treatises, works on astronomy, on music theory, on linguistics, on theology. The modern mind struggles to comprehend this productivity. We celebrate authors who write one significant book every few years. We're impressed by scholars who publish a handful of papers annually. Ibn Sina was producing work at a pace that seems physically impossible, and not just producing it, but producing work of such quality that it remained authoritative for centuries. His Canon of Medicine was translated into Latin in the 12th century and became the standard medical textbook in European universities until the 17th century. That's 500 years of authority, 500 years of medical students across Europe learning from a text written by a Persian Muslim who died in 1037. Even today, medical historians study Ibn Sina's work not just as historical curiosity, but as genuinely insightful analysis of disease and treatment. How did he do it? The honest answer is we don't entirely know. Medieval Islamic scholars didn't write detailed accounts of their daily routines or time management strategies. We can infer some things from scattered historical references and from the nature of scholarly life in that era, but much remains mysterious. What we do know is that Ibn Sina apparently slept very little. He mentions in his writings that sleep was something he granted his body reluctantly, when exhaustion made further work impossible. He also worked with students and assistants who helped copy manuscripts, conduct research, gather materials. Medieval scholarship wasn't the isolated individual pursuit we sometimes imagine. It was often collaborative, though with clear hierarchies of master and student. We also know that Ibn Sina maintained social connections that supported his work. He had friends, patrons, correspondents across the Islamic world. These relationships provided not just financial support, but intellectual stimulation, access to rare books, news of recent discoveries, criticism and feedback that refined his thinking. The myth of the isolated genius, working alone in a tower, doesn't match the reality of medieval Islamic scholarly networks. And we know that despite his productivity, Ibn Sina still prayed 5 times daily. There are no historical sources suggesting he neglected this obligation. He lived in a society where skipping prayer would be noticed, where religious observance was both personal conviction and social performance. Even when traveling, even when imprisoned, even when sick, and he was frequently sick in his later years, he maintained the ritual structure that governed Muslim life. Think about what that means for time management. 5 prayers daily, each requiring ablution, and taking 15 to 30 minutes, including preparation and travel to a mosque, if that's where you're praying. That's at minimum 90 minutes daily. More realistically, 2 to 3 hours when you account for interruptions to workflow, preparation time, social interactions around communal prayer. Ibn Sina still found time to write a 1,000,000-word medical encyclopedia and hundreds of other works. The comparison to our own habits is almost embarrassing. We check our phones hundreds of times daily, each interruption fragmenting attention and destroying productivity. We browse social media for hours. We binge-watch television series. We have objectively more free time than any previous generation in human history. Yet we accomplish a tiny fraction of what someone like Ibn Sina did while also maintaining a rigorous religious schedule. Of course, we should acknowledge that Ibn Sina had certain advantages. He didn't have to cook his own meals or clean his own home. He had servants for that. He didn't have to do laundry, shop for groceries, or handle the countless mundane tasks that consume modern life. His position as a court physician and advisor came with staff and resources that freed him from many practical burdens. He also didn't have children, as far as historical records indicate. This isn't entirely certain. Medieval biographers often didn't mention personal details like family life, but there are no references to wives or children in sources about him. Whether this was by choice, by circumstance, or simply unrecorded, the absence of family obligations undoubtedly freed up significant time and mental energy. Still, even accounting for these advantages, his productivity remains extraordinary. And it's worth noting that his religious obligations weren't just the 5 daily prayers. There was also Ramadan every year, 30 days of fasting that still required maintaining his scholarly work and court duties. There were the additional voluntary prayers that pious Muslims performed. There was Quran recitation, religious study, attendance at mosques for Friday congregational prayers, which included sermons that could last an hour or more. Ibn Sina's life demonstrates something that our modern secular culture sometimes struggles to grasp: that religious structure and intellectual achievement aren't necessarily in conflict. We tend to imagine that serious scholarship requires throwing off religious constraints, that scientific progress demands freeing ourselves from superstition and ritual. Yet here was one of history's greatest scientific minds, living fully within the Islamic religious framework, seeing no contradiction between his faith and his empirical investigations of nature. This isn't to say there were never tensions. Ibn Sina's philosophical views got him into trouble with more conservative religious scholars. His Aristotelianism, the influence of Greek philosophy on his thinking, led him to conclusions about the nature of the soul, the eternity of the world, and divine knowledge that some considered heretical. The great theologian Al-Ghazali would later write a detailed refutation of Ibn Sina's philosophical positions, accusing him of unbelief on certain points. But these theological disputes played out within the Islamic intellectual tradition, not outside it. Ibn Sina considered himself a Muslim, prayed as a Muslim, lived as a Muslim, even if his philosophical sophistication led him to interpretations that differed from mainstream orthodoxy. The Islamic world of his time had space for this kind of intellectual diversity, at least among educated elites. In his final years, Ibn Sina lived in Hamadan, in western Iran, serving the local ruler. He was in his 50s, which was elderly by medieval standards, and his health was declining. Various sources mention stomach problems, possibly some kind of chronic digestive disorder, exacerbated by his admitted fondness for wine, and perhaps other dietary indiscretions. Medieval medicine, even at its most advanced, had limited understanding of chronic internal diseases. Ibn Sina tried treating himself naturally, using the medical knowledge he had spent a lifetime accumulating. This included various drugs and purgatives that probably did more harm than good. Medieval Islamic medicine, for all its advances, still operated within a theoretical framework of humoral theory inherited from Galen, the idea that health depended on balancing 4 bodily fluids. When the body was out of balance, the solution was often aggressive purging or bloodletting to remove excess bad humors. Imagine the irony. The greatest physician of the medieval world, unable to cure himself, applying treatments that modern medicine would recognize as counterproductive. He knew more about the human body than perhaps anyone alive in his time, yet that knowledge was still insufficient to address his own illness, a reminder that even genius operates within the limitations of its era's collective understanding. He died in 1037, during Ramadan, which seems almost poetically appropriate for someone who lived his entire life within the rhythm of Islamic religious observance. His students and friends were with him. According to tradition, he freed his slaves before death and gave away his possessions to the poor, actions recommended for Muslims approaching death, a final settling of accounts before divine judgment. One of his students, Al-Juzjani, who had worked closely with him for years, wrote a brief biography that provides most of what we know about Ibn Sina's personal life. The biography is frustratingly sparse on emotional or intimate details. Medieval Islamic biographical writing focused on achievements and external events rather than interior life, but it conveys genuine affection and respect. Al-Juzjani describes a teacher who was demanding but generous with his knowledge, someone who pushed his students hard but invested in their education. After Ibn Sina's death, his works continued to spread across the Islamic world and eventually into Latin Christendom. The canon of medicine was translated multiple times, copied in countless manuscripts, commented upon by generations of medical scholars. His philosophical works influenced both Islamic and Jewish philosophers, and later, through Latin translations, European scholastic philosophers like Thomas Aquinas. In a very real sense, Ibn Sina never died. His ideas kept circulating, evolving, spawning new ideas, shaping how humans understood medicine and philosophy for centuries. The individual human, the man who got stomach aches, who drank wine, who wrote by candlelight until his eyes ached, who prayed 5 times daily, who fled from political turmoil, who served various patrons with varying degrees of enthusiasm. That man died in 1037, but the intellectual legacy achieved a kind of immortality that medieval Muslims believed was reserved for the afterlife. Which brings us to an interesting question. What motivated someone like Ibn Sina? What drove this relentless productivity, this refusal to rest, this compulsion to write even when circumstances suggested that survival should take priority over scholarship? Part of the answer is surely intrinsic curiosity. Ibn Sina seems to have genuinely loved learning for its own sake. His writings convey enthusiasm for discovery, pleasure in solving difficult problems, satisfaction in organizing scattered knowledge into coherent systems. There's a joy in his work that transcends mere duty or ambition. But there was also ambition. Ibn Sina was well aware of his own brilliance and wanted recognition for it. He sought positions at important courts, competed with other scholars for patronage and prestige, wrote with an authority that sometimes crossed into arrogance. He wanted to be remembered, to have influence, to matter. These are deeply human desires, neither noble nor shameful, just honest. And there was religious conviction. Ibn Sina believed that pursuing knowledge was a form of worship, that understanding God's creation was a way of honoring the Creator. This wasn't just convenient rationalization. It was a genuine theological position supported by Quranic verses encouraging observation and reflection. The famous hadith, "Seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave," circulated widely in Islamic scholarly culture. Learning wasn't secular activity in opposition to faith. It was religious activity that fulfilled divine commands. So Ibn Sina's daily prayers and his scientific investigations weren't separate spheres of life requiring compartmentalization. They were integrated parts of a unified worldview where physical health, intellectual truth, and spiritual devotion all pointed toward the same ultimate reality. When he studied anatomy, he was studying divine creation. When he developed medical treatments, he was participating in divine mercy. When he philosophized about the nature of existence, he was approaching divine wisdom. Modern people, especially those from secular backgrounds, often find this integration incomprehensible. We're used to thinking of religion and science as separate domains, sometimes complementary, but often in tension. We see historical examples of religious authorities suppressing scientific inquiry and conclude that progress requires secularization. The medieval Islamic scholarly tradition, at its best, suggests a different possibility: that religious conviction can motivate rather than hinder intellectual work. Of course, this wasn't universally true. There were tensions, suppressions, scholars who faced persecution for their ideas. The Islamic world's intellectual golden age eventually declined. And while historians debate the causes, religious conservatism certainly played a role. But for someone like Ibn Sina, living when and where he did, the tension simply wasn't that sharp. He could be both a devout Muslim and a radical philosopher, both a man who prayed 5 times daily and a physician who dissected human bodies despite religious squeamishness about handling corpses. As you lie here, letting these details wash over you, perhaps you can appreciate the strangeness of this life. A man who lived 1,000 years ago, in a culture radically different from modern Western society, somehow managed to be both completely of his time and eerily relevant to ours. His medical observations remain insightful. His philosophical questions remain current. His integration of faith and reason remains provocative. And his productivity remains shaming to those of us who struggle to return an email in a timely fashion. But perhaps that's the wrong way to think about it. Perhaps Ibn Sina's life isn't meant to be a measuring stick that makes us feel inadequate, but rather a reminder of human potential under the right circumstances. Given resources, education, social support, clear sense of purpose, and yes, relentless discipline, humans can achieve extraordinary things. The discipline part is non-negotiable. Talent without discipline produces nothing. Ibn Sina had both, maintained daily for decades, within a religious framework that demanded constant attention and regular interruption. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. The lesson, if there is one, might be that structure enables rather than constrains creativity, that limitations force focus, that obligations, even religious obligations that seem burdensome, can provide the scaffolding around which a productive life gets built. Or maybe there's no lesson at all. Maybe Ibn Sina was simply an exceptional individual, an outlier whose achievements tell us nothing useful about our own potential. Maybe trying to extract universal principles from one brilliant life is exactly the kind of error that a philosopher like Ibn Sina would warn against, overgeneralizing from limited data. Either way, he's been dead for nearly 1,000 years. His stomach problems are long resolved. His court intrigues no longer matter. His religious observances, so central to his daily life, are finished. What remains are words on pages, ideas in minds, influence rippling forward through time. Not a bad legacy for someone who spent so much of his life feeling sick, politically insecure, and exhausted from too much work and too little sleep. Perhaps you're feeling a bit exhausted yourself now, listening to this account of relentless productivity. The comfort of your bed feels particularly appealing compared to Ibn Sina's life of constant movement, political instability, and dawn prayers. That's perfectly appropriate. Rest is good. You don't need to be Ibn Sina. Nobody needs to be Ibn Sina. One per millennium is probably sufficient. Let yourself drift now. Let the image of this long-dead scholar fade into the comfortable darkness of approaching sleep. His story is told, his life examined, his contradictions noted and forgiven by the passage of centuries. Tomorrow, you'll wake without a prayer schedule to maintain, without a medical encyclopedia to write, without court intrigues to navigate. Lucky you. Very lucky indeed. Now that we've exhausted ourselves contemplating Ibn Sina's impossible productivity, let's turn to something that should be relaxing. A mystery, not a murder mystery, though there's certainly death involved. Not a detective story, though historians have been playing detective for centuries. Rather, the mystery of what happened to one of history's greatest collections of knowledge, and why we can't quite agree on whether it was ever as magnificent as the legends claim. Welcome to the House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah in Arabic, an institution that may have been the Library of Alexandria of the medieval Islamic world, or may have been significantly more modest than that, depending on which sources you trust and how you interpret ambiguous references in texts written centuries after the fact. The uncertainty itself is almost soothing in its irresolution, a historical puzzle that will never be completely solved, allowing your mind to wander through possibilities rather than marching toward definitive conclusions. The traditional story goes something like this. In the early 9th century, during the reign of Caliph al-Ma'mun of the Abbasid dynasty, Baghdad became home to an extraordinary institution dedicated to the translation, preservation, and advancement of knowledge. Scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond gathered there to translate Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Syriac texts into Arabic. The library supposedly held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Mathematicians developed algebra, astronomers refined celestial models, physicians advanced medical understanding. Philosophers debated the nature of existence. It was a golden age of intellectual flourishing, a moment when human knowledge expanded in ways that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Then, in 1258, the Mongol army under Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad. The city burned, the caliphate fell, and according to legend, so many books were thrown into the Tigris River that the water ran black with ink for days, and soldiers could cross the river walking on floating manuscripts. The House of Wisdom was destroyed, its scholars killed or scattered, its accumulated knowledge lost forever. Western civilization would have to wait centuries to recover what Baghdad had known. It's a compelling narrative, perhaps too compelling. The destruction of knowledge is an emotionally powerful story, one that appears repeatedly in human history and mythology. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, the destruction of Mayan codices, the Nazi book burnings, were drawn to these stories of cultural catastrophe, these moments when human achievement is deliberately erased. They confirm our fears about fragility and barbarism, about how easily civilization can collapse. But here's where things get interesting, and by interesting, I mean frustratingly ambiguous. The more historians examine the primary sources about the House of Wisdom, the less certain everything becomes. Was it really a massive library and research institution? Or was it primarily a translation bureau? Did it even have a physical building? Or was it more of a concept, a loosely associated network of scholars working under caliphal patronage? And when the Mongols destroyed Baghdad, how much was actually lost versus how much had already been copied and distributed to other libraries across the Islamic world? The answers depend on which medieval sources you trust, how you interpret their often vague descriptions, and what you think they meant by terms like Beit al-Hikmah, which could refer to anything from a specific building to a general intellectual movement. Let's start with what we can say with reasonable confidence, which is less than you might hope, but more than nothing. Baghdad was founded in 762 CE by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur as the new capital of the Islamic world. The location was chosen carefully, on the Tigris River, at a crossroads of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean, Central Asia, India, and China. Within decades, it grew into one of the world's largest cities, possibly reaching a population of 1 million people at its height, though population estimates for medieval cities are always somewhat speculative. The Abbasid caliphs, unlike their Umayyad predecessors who had focused more on military expansion and Arab identity, were interested in knowledge for its own sake and for its practical applications. They wanted to understand Greek philosophy, master Persian administrative techniques, learn Indian mathematics, acquire Syriac medical knowledge. This wasn't purely altruistic intellectual curiosity. Knowledge was power, useful for governance, military technology, economic advantage. But it created an environment where scholarship was valued and funded. By the time Caliph Harun al-Rashid ruled in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Yes, the same Harun al-Rashid who appears in the Arabian Nights stories, though the real man was considerably more complex and less whimsical than those tales suggest. There was already significant translation activity happening in Baghdad. Scholars were being paid to travel to Byzantine territories to acquire Greek manuscripts, to translate them into Arabic, to write commentaries explaining difficult concepts. Harun's son, al-Mamun, who ruled from 813 to 833, expanded these efforts considerably. Al-Mamun was himself intellectually inclined, interested in astronomy, theology, and philosophy. He supposedly had a dream in which Aristotle appeared to him and discoursed on the nature of goodness, which Al-Mamun took as divine endorsement of pursuing Greek philosophy. Whether this dream actually happened or was later invented to justify his intellectual interests is anyone's guess, but the story circulated widely in medieval sources. Under Al-Mamun, the translation movement reached its peak. This much is clear from multiple sources. Teams of translators worked systematically through the Greek philosophical and scientific corpus, producing Arabic versions of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Ptolemy, Euclid, and many others. These weren't crude literal translations, but sophisticated attempts to convey complex ideas, often involving multiple drafts, collaboration between translators who knew Greek and Arabic scholars who understood the subject matter, and extensive commentaries clarifying difficult passages. Some of these translators became famous in their own right. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Christian from what is now Iraq, was perhaps the greatest, producing translations of Golan's medical works that were so accurate they're still studied by historians of medicine. He reportedly traveled to Byzantine territories and as far as Alexandria searching for rare manuscripts. He learned Greek thoroughly, developed sophisticated translation techniques, trained a school of translators who continued his work. This translation movement, supported by caliphal patronage and wealthy private sponsors, transformed Arabic into a scientific language, expanding its vocabulary to handle technical concepts that didn't exist in early 7th century Arabic. New words were coined, Greek terms were transliterated, Persian and Syriac words were borrowed, creating a rich technical vocabulary that would later be borrowed into Latin and eventually into English. Words like algebra, algorithm, chemistry, alcohol, all ultimately derived from Arabic. Now, somewhere in all of this activity, there was something called the Bait al-Hikmah. The term appears in various medieval Arabic sources, but here's the problem. It's not always clear what exactly they're referring to. Some sources seem to describe it as a library. Others mention it as a translation bureau. Some texts imply it was a physical building. Others suggest it was more of an institution or network. The sources often don't provide the kind of concrete architectural or organizational details that would let us reconstruct exactly what it was. The earliest mentions of the Bait al-Hikmah appear in texts written a century or more after its supposed founding. This isn't unusual for medieval history. Immediate contemporary accounts are rare for most institutions, but it does mean we're reading descriptions written from memory, tradition, and possibly idealization. When later scholars looked back at the intellectual golden age of Baghdad, they may have simplified and romanticized what was actually a more complicated and decentralized reality. Some historians argue that the Bait al-Hikmah was indeed a major institution, analogous to a modern research university or national library. They point to references describing a large collection of manuscripts, reading rooms, staff of translators and copyists, administrative organization. They note that caliphs maintained extensive personal libraries, and that the Bait al-Hikmah may have been the caliphal library expanded to serve broader scholarly purposes. Other historians are more skeptical. They note that many of the most famous translators and scholars associated with the Bait al-Hikmah seem to have worked independently or in small groups, often in their own homes or in private patrons' libraries. They point out that the grandest descriptions of the institution appear in the latest sources, suggesting legendary embellishment over time. They argue that Bait al-Hikmah may have been a loose term for the general translation movement rather than a specific building or institution. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, which is historically likely but narratively unsatisfying. There probably was some kind of official or semi-official institution connected to the Caliphal court, maintaining a collection of manuscripts and supporting translation work. But it probably wasn't as centralized, as organizationally sophisticated, or as singularly important as later legends suggested. Most of Baghdad's intellectual activity probably happened in a distributed fashion, in mosques, in private homes, in various libraries maintained by wealthy patrons, in informal scholarly networks. But whether the House of Wisdom was one magnificent building or a network of scholarly activity, what's unquestionable is that 9th and 10th century Baghdad witnessed an extraordinary intellectual flowering. Mathematics advanced in ways that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. The mathematician al-Khwarizmi, whose name gave us the word algorithm, systematized algebra and introduced Indian numerals to the Islamic world, from where they would eventually reach Europe as Arabic numerals. Astronomers built observatories, refined Ptolemaic models of planetary motion, created accurate astronomical tables. Physicians like Al-Razi wrote comprehensive medical encyclopedias. Philosophers engaged with Greek, thought in sophisticated ways, creating syntheses of Aristotelian philosophy and Islamic theology. This intellectual activity was distributed across the Islamic world. Baghdad was central, but not exclusive. Córdoba in Spain had its own library reportedly containing 400,000 manuscripts, though again, medieval number claims should be taken with skepticism. Cairo, Damascus, Bukhara, Samarkand all had libraries, translation activity, scholarly communities. Knowledge circulated through correspondence, through traveling scholars, through copied manuscripts sent from one library to another. The system was decentralized and resilient in ways that a single institution, however grand, could never be. When you have knowledge distributed across dozens of libraries in different cities, the destruction of one, however catastrophic locally, doesn't erase everything, which brings us to 1258 and the Mongol destruction of Baghdad. The Mongol conquests were catastrophic for the Islamic world. Make no mistake. The Mongol Empire, under Genghis Khan and his successors, swept across Central Asia and into the Middle East with a military effectiveness that few could resist. Cities that surrendered were sometimes spared, but those that resisted faced total destruction. Baghdad resisted. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, arrived with a massive army in late 1257. The siege lasted several weeks. When the city finally fell in February 1258, the Mongols did what victorious armies throughout history have done when facing a city that made them work for it. They sacked it thoroughly and brutally. The Caliph al-Mustasim, the last Abbasid caliph in Baghdad, was captured. According to various accounts, Hulagu had him rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, because superstition held that royal blood shouldn't be spilled directly on the ground. Whether this specific detail is true or legendary doesn't particularly matter. He died, and with him the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad ended. The population of Baghdad was massacred on a massive scale. Estimates vary wildly, as they always do for medieval casualties, but probably hundreds of thousands died. The city was looted, buildings destroyed, irrigation systems damaged. It would take centuries for Baghdad to recover demographically and economically. Books were certainly destroyed. Multiple sources confirm this. The Mongols, coming from a nomadic culture with different values around written knowledge, apparently saw little reason to preserve libraries. Manuscripts were torn apart, thrown into the river used for fuel, trampled by horses. The image of the Tigris running black with ink appears in several medieval accounts and has become iconic, though whether this literally happened or is poetic exaggeration is impossible to verify. But here's the crucial question. How much knowledge was actually lost? If the House of Wisdom was indeed a single massive library containing unique copies of rare texts, then its destruction would represent an intellectual catastrophe on par with Alexandria. But if, as seems more likely, Baghdad's intellectual resources were distributed across multiple libraries, and if most important texts had already been copied and sent to other cities across the Islamic world, then the damage, while severe locally, may not have been the decisive blow to Islamic intellectual culture that popular narratives suggest. Consider, many of the Greek texts translated into Arabic in Baghdad still exist today. We have them because they survived in Arabic manuscripts preserved in libraries from Spain to Persia. When Europeans later wanted to recover Greek knowledge, they often translated these Arabic versions back into Latin, sometimes discovering that the Arabic versions were more complete than surviving Greek originals. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, written more than 2 centuries before the Mongol conquest, survived because it had been copied hundreds or thousands of times and distributed across the Islamic world. Al-Khwarizmi's algebra texts survived. Astronomical tables survived. Medical encyclopedias survived. Philosophical treatises survived. What we've lost, to the extent we've lost anything specific to the House of Wisdom, are probably administrative records, personal correspondence, working drafts, commentaries that never became famous enough to be widely copied, texts that existed in only 1 or a few copies. These are real losses, certainly, but they're the kind of ordinary attrition that happens to any historical period's documentation. The larger decline of Islamic intellectual culture, and there's no question that a decline happened, can't be attributed solely or even primarily to the Mongol destruction of Baghdad. The causes were complex. The gradual shift toward religious conservatism and away from philosophical speculation, the closing of the gate of ijtihad as legal schools became more rigid, political fragmentation that made large-scale patronage difficult, economic decline in many regions, the Black Death in the 14th century, and, yes, military invasions and political instability. Baghdad's destruction in 1258 was part of this story, but not the whole story. The city's intellectual decline had begun before the Mongols arrived and continued in many places they never conquered. Conversely, some regions flourished intellectually after 1258. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria, for instance, maintained substantial libraries and scholarly activity into the 15th century. So what are we left with? A mystery without a clear solution, a catastrophe whose magnitude we can't precisely measure, a legend that contains truth, but how much truth remains uncertain. The House of Wisdom exists now primarily in imagination and inference, reconstructed from scattered references in medieval texts, from lists of scholars and translators, from the intellectual output that survives. We can be confident that something significant happened in Baghdad during the 9th and 10th centuries. That knowledge was translated and created and preserved. That scholars collaborated in ways that advanced human understanding. Whether that something was a single magnificent institution or a more distributed network matters less, perhaps, than the fact that it happened at all. There's something almost comforting in this uncertainty, a reminder that history is always partially hidden, that we can never fully recover the past, that we're always working with fragments and educated guesses. The grandest achievements of our ancestors exist now only as echoes, reconstructed from incomplete evidence, interpreted through our own cultural lenses and assumptions. When you imagine the House of Wisdom, what you're really imagining is an ideal, a place where knowledge is valued, where different cultures collaborate, where curiosity drives inquiry, where learning happens for its own sake. Whether that ideal perfectly match the messy historical reality is almost beside the point. The ideal itself has power, has influenced how later generations thought about knowledge and its preservation. The scholars who worked in Baghdad, whether in a grand central institution or in scattered private libraries, were doing what scholars have always done: reading, writing, thinking, arguing, teaching, preserving what came before while creating something new. They woke before dawn for Fajr prayer, as we discussed earlier. They fasted during Ramadan. They lived in a world of horses and oil lamps, of hand-copied manuscripts and limited communication, of political instability and disease. And yet they created works that outlasted empires, ideas that influenced civilizations, translations that preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Not because they had perfect institutional support. Institutional support was intermittent and politically contingent, but because they were individually and collectively committed to the work. When the Mongols destroyed Baghdad, they killed people and burned buildings, but they couldn't destroy the ideas that had already spread across the Islamic world and beyond. Knowledge had been copied, distributed, built upon in other cities. The work continued, albeit diminished, in Cairo and Damascus and Cordoba and Bukhara. The real tragedy wasn't the destruction of buildings or even manuscripts. Those are recoverable, reproducible. The real tragedy was the death of the scholars themselves, the disruption of networks and communities, the psychological impact of catastrophe on survivors, the shift in priorities from intellectual work to mere survival. But even that tragedy wasn't absolute. Some scholars survived, fled to other regions, continued their work. Students carried forward what they'd learned. The tradition bent but didn't break entirely. Perhaps the lesson, if we're looking for lessons in a segment meant to help you drift toward sleep, is that knowledge is simultaneously fragile and resilient. Fragile because manuscripts burn, libraries can be destroyed, civilizations can collapse. Resilient because ideas once released into the world tend to survive in unexpected ways, copied and adapted and transmitted across generations and cultures. The House of Wisdom, real or legendary, centralized or distributed, destroyed or simply declined, represented a moment when human beings made knowledge a priority, when caliphs and wealthy patrons spent resources on translation and research, rather than only on military conquest or luxury, when scholars from different religious and ethnic backgrounds collaborated on understanding the world. That moment passed, as all moments do. The Abbasid Caliphate fell. The Mongol invasions devastated much of the Islamic world. Political power shifted. Priorities changed. The Great Translation movement ended. Its work largely complete. Most major Greek texts had been translated. Most useful knowledge from other cultures had been incorporated. What remained were the books, scattered across 100 libraries, copied by thousands of scribes, read by generations of students, including eventually European students who would translate them into Latin and spark their own intellectual renaissance. The ink may have run black in the Tigris for a few days in 1258, an image that haunts the historical imagination. But most of the ink had already dried on pages safely stored in distant libraries, waiting for readers not yet born. There's something peaceful in that realization, that catastrophe, however severe, couldn't erase what had been written and copied and distributed. That human intellectual achievement has a durability that transcends individual institutions and political regimes. As you lie here, imagining halls filled with manuscripts, translators bent over desks, scholars debating in courtyards, let the images blur and soften. The details don't matter as much as the fact of it, that people cared enough about knowledge to preserve it, translate it, expand it, pass it forward. The house of wisdom is gone, if it ever existed in the form legends describe. But something of what it represented survives in every library, every university, every community of scholars pursuing understanding across cultural boundaries. The Tigris flows on, clear now, its brief darkness long since washed out to sea. The city that was built on its banks was destroyed and rebuilt across centuries of rise and fall. But the books remain, in one form or another, copied, translated, digital now rather than manuscript, but still readable, still teaching, still connecting minds across centuries. That's a kind of immortality more reliable than stone or bronze, more enduring than political power or military conquest. The scholars of Baghdad, whether they worked in a grand central institution or in scattered private libraries, achieved something that outlasted them by centuries and will outlast us as well. Not bad for people who had to wake before dawn to pray, who wrote by candlelight, who lacked every technology we consider essential for intellectual work. They just had curiosity, discipline, patronage when they were lucky, and the belief that knowledge mattered enough to preserve and expand. And apparently that was sufficient. Let that sufficiency comfort you as you drift. You don't need perfect conditions or ideal institutions to do meaningful work. You just need commitment and the willingness to continue despite difficulties. Though you can think about that tomorrow. Right now, rest. Let the lost library fade into comfortable darkness, its mysteries unsolved, but somehow less pressing as sleep approaches. The books have survived. That's what matters. The rest is just detail, interesting but not essential, worth contemplating but not worth losing sleep over. And on that note, let's move from mysterious lost knowledge to something more concrete. The people who controlled access to knowledge and religion, who lived comfortable lives while others struggled. The religious elites, the scholars, the ones who had it relatively easy. But that's for the next segment, and you can listen to it when you're ready, or drift off now. Either way is perfectly acceptable. Sleep well, time traveler. The Tigris flows on, and the books somehow survive. So far, we've explored what it was like to be an ordinary believer. Exhausting. We've examined the life of an exceptional scholar. Even more exhausting, though productive. We've pondered lost knowledge and ambiguous institutions, intellectually exhausting. Now, let's turn to a group that had it considerably better than most. The religious elites, the scholars, the keepers of knowledge who managed to convert their learning into comfort, status, and influence. This is where the irony becomes almost delicious. In a religion that constantly preached humility, equality before God, and the temporary nature of worldly wealth, a class of religious professionals emerged who lived quite comfortably indeed, thank you very much. They had the best food, the finest homes, access to rulers, respect from communities, and significantly fewer calluses on their hands than the average believer who actually had to work for a living. Not all scholars were wealthy, of course. Many lived modest or even impoverished lives. But the successful ones, the ones who secured patronage or important positions, the ones whose learning translated into social capital, they inhabited a world markedly different from the common believers who struggled through 5 daily prayers, while also plowing fields or hauling goods in markets. Let's examine this comfortable world, shall we? Not to condemn it. Hypocrisy and self-interest are universal human traits, not specific to medieval Islam, but to understand how religious knowledge became a pathway to privilege, and what that meant for both the knowledge keepers and the communities they served. We begin with the most fundamental fact. In a largely illiterate society, literacy is power. In medieval Islamic civilization, literacy rates were higher than in medieval Europe, significantly higher in some regions and periods, but still probably never exceeded 20% of the population, and in many areas were far lower. Most people couldn't read. Most people couldn't write. Most people had memorized some Quranic verses through hearing them recited, but couldn't access the text directly. This created an immediate power differential. The scholar who could read the Quran, who understood Arabic grammar, who knew Hadith literature, who could cite legal precedents, this person possessed knowledge that others desperately needed but couldn't access independently. Need to understand an inheritance dispute according to Islamic law. You need a scholar. Need to know whether a business transaction is religiously permissible? Scholar. Need to determine the correct direction toward Mecca in an unfamiliar location? Scholar. Need to understand what a particular Quranic verse means? Scholar. Definitely scholar, because the Quran's classical Arabic is sophisticated and elusive in ways that even native Arabic speakers often found challenging. This dependency created opportunity. Not necessarily cynical exploitation. Many scholars were genuinely pious and served their communities faithfully, but opportunity nonetheless. Knowledge was a commodity that could be exchanged for other goods. Money, certainly, but also respect, influence, access to power, social status that could be passed to one's children. The most successful scholars often came from families that were already educated. Literacy was typically passed from father to son, creating scholarly dynasties that maintained knowledge and status across generations. Yes, there were exceptions. Brilliant boys from poor families occasionally attracted patronage and rose through merit. But the system favored those born into educated households, with resources to support years of study. Consider what it took to become a recognized scholar in medieval Islamic society. First, you needed to memorize the Quran, all of it, which, as we discussed with Ibn Sina, takes years and requires someone to teach you proper recitation. Then you needed to learn Arabic grammar at an advanced level, not conversational Arabic, but the technical grammatical analysis that allowed you to parse complex classical texts. Then you needed to study Hadith literature, learning not just the content, but the chains of transmission that validated each saying's authenticity. Then jurisprudence, theology, perhaps logic and rhetoric if you were ambitious. This education took years, a decade or more of intensive study before you could claim real expertise. During this time, you weren't earning a living through manual labor. You were dependent on family support, charitable endowments, or patronage from someone wealthy enough to invest in your education. Most families couldn't afford this. Most boys needed to start contributing economically by their early teens at the latest. The farmer's son was plowing fields. The craftsman's son was learning a trade. The merchant's son was helping with the business. Only families with sufficient resources could spare a son for years of religious education that might or might not eventually translate into income. But if you successfully completed this education, if you gained recognition as a scholar, the rewards could be substantial. Let's walk through the various ways a successful scholar might live considerably more comfortably than the average believer. First, there were endowed positions. Wealthy Muslims seeking religious merit would establish a waqf, a charitable endowment, to support a mosque, a school, a library, or other pious institution. These endowments provided salaries for various positions. The imam, who led prayers, the muezzin, who called people to prayer, the teacher, who instructed students, the librarian, who maintained manuscripts. These weren't always generous salaries, but they were stable income that didn't require physical labor. A position as a mosque imam in a prosperous neighborhood or important city could be quite comfortable. You led the 5 daily prayers, which you were doing anyway as a religious obligation, so it's not like this was additional work. You delivered the Friday sermon, which required preparation but allowed you to demonstrate your learning and oratory skills. You might be consulted on religious questions, which enhanced your reputation. And for this, you received a regular salary, often supplemented by gifts from grateful community members. The Friday sermon, the khutbah, deserves special attention because it was both a religious duty and a political act. The scholar delivering it mentioned the ruling caliph or sultan by name, essentially legitimizing political authority through religious endorsement. This made the Friday preacher a politically important figure, someone rulers wanted to keep loyal. A preacher who criticized the ruler or omitted the ruler's name from the khutbah was making a powerful statement that could have serious consequences, both for the preacher and for political stability. Smart rulers understood this and made sure important preachers were well compensated. A generous salary, gifts, perhaps a nice house. These investments in religious legitimacy were cheaper than dealing with religiously motivated opposition. The preacher, in turn, had strong incentive to maintain good relations with political authorities. Not necessarily crude bribery or corruption, though that certainly happened, but a mutually beneficial arrangement where religious authority supported political power and political power protected and enriched religious authority. Beyond mosque positions, there were educational roles. The madrasa, the Islamic school, became increasingly important in the medieval period as an institution for training scholars. Major cities had prestigious madrasas endowed by wealthy patrons, offering free education to students and salaries to teachers. Teaching at a famous madrasa brought prestige, income, and access to the brightest students who might later become important scholars themselves, creating networks of intellectual lineage and mutual support. The most distinguished professors at the most prestigious madrasas lived quite well. They had comfortable homes, often provided by the endowment. They had servants, because people of their status didn't cook their own meals or clean their own homes. They had access to extensive libraries. They received gifts from students' families, particularly wealthy families whose sons they tutored. They were invited to social occasions with other elites, creating networks that transcended purely religious circles. And their work, while intellectually demanding, wasn't physically taxing. Teaching meant sitting and talking, occasionally writing. Yes, Preparation required effort, and some teachers took their pedagogical duties very seriously. But compared to plowing a field in summer heat or carrying goods through market crowds, it was remarkably pleasant labor. Then there were the court positions. Rulers needed religious advisors for various purposes, interpreting Islamic law on matters of governance, providing religious legitimacy for political decisions, serving as judges in the Sharia court system, tutoring royal children, consulting on religious matters that intersected with policy. These positions could be extraordinarily lucrative. The chief judge, the qadi, in a major city, was typically a scholar of recognized learning appointed by political authority. He heard legal cases, rendered judgments according to Islamic law, and essentially wielded significant power over people's lives. Marriage disputes, inheritance cases, commercial disagreements, criminal matters, all came before the qadi. The position came with a substantial salary, often supplemented by fees from litigants, and carried enormous prestige. Now, the fees from litigants present an interesting ethical problem. Islamic law theoretically prohibited judges from accepting payment from parties in cases they were judging, because this creates obvious corruption incentives. But judges still needed to eat, and the line between acceptable gifts and corrupt bribes was often fuzzy in practice. Medieval legal texts are filled with discussions about what a judge could properly accept, suggesting this was an ongoing concern and likely an ongoing practice that troubled the more scrupulous scholars. Some judges became wealthy through their positions, not necessarily through outright corruption, though that certainly occurred, but through the various perks and opportunities that came with the role. A respected judge might be asked to witness important contracts, for which he'd receive a fee. He might be consulted on complex legal matters outside his official duties, again for compensation. Wealthy families might seek to marry their daughters to him, bringing substantial dowries. His own children would have enhanced marriage prospects thanks to his status. The judge's courtroom was typically more comfortable than the market or the field. He sat often on cushions, sometimes in a specially designated area of the mosque or in a dedicated court building. Petitioners came to him. He didn't go to them. His work required learning and careful thought, certainly, but not physical exertion. He wasn't waking before dawn to plow or bake or build. He was waking before dawn to pray, then proceeding to his courtroom, where people treated him with deference. Beyond formal positions, scholars could earn income through various forms of private work. Wealthy families might hire a scholar to tutor their children, paying handsomely for private instruction. Business partnerships often required a scholar to certify that contracts met Islamic legal requirements, for which he'd be compensated. Writing legal opinions, fatwas, on complex matters could generate income from those requesting the opinions. Some scholars became quite entrepreneurial, recognizing that their knowledge was marketable. They might copy manuscripts for sale, an activity that combined scholarly work with commercial opportunity. They might establish small private schools, charging fees for instruction. They might write books and receive payment from patrons or purchasers. The most successful combined multiple income streams, a salaried position for stability, private tutoring for additional income, writing for prestige and sometimes money, connections with wealthy patrons who might provide occasional large gifts. And let's talk about those wealthy patrons, because the patronage system was central to how successful scholars lived. A wealthy merchant or government official seeking religious merit and social prestige might adopt a promising scholar, providing him with a stipend, access to a library, perhaps housing, in exchange for the scholar's presence, his prayers for the patron's well-being, his enhancement of the patron's reputation as a supporter of learning. This arrangement could be remarkably comfortable for the scholar. Imagine, you have your basic needs met without having to worry about where your next meal comes from. You can focus entirely on your studies and writing. You have access to books that would otherwise be unavailable. You live in a wealthy household with all the amenities that implies: good food, comfortable quarters, servants handling mundane tasks. In exchange, what does the patron require? Your presence at social occasions, demonstrating that he's the kind of person who supports scholars. Your prayers and blessings, providing spiritual benefit and social legitimacy. Perhaps some tutoring of his children. Perhaps witnessing documents or providing legal opinions when needed. Perhaps simply the prestige of association with a learned man. For an ambitious scholar, this was an excellent arrangement. For a lazy scholar, it was paradise, comfortable living, in exchange for minimal work beyond what your religious obligations required anyway. The temptation to settle into comfortable dependency, to avoid controversial positions that might displease the patron, to prioritize the patron's interests over strict intellectual independence, must have been substantial. The most successful scholars managed to maintain integrity while also navigating patronage relationships skillfully. They chose patrons carefully, maintained multiple sources of support to avoid complete dependency on any single benefactor, built reputations solid enough that they couldn't be easily discarded if they occasionally displeased a patron. But this required skill, luck, and often a certain amount of moral flexibility about exactly how much truth one told to power. Now, let's consider the material comfort the system could provide. A successful scholar in a major city like Baghdad, Cairo, or Cordoba might live in a substantial house with multiple rooms, a courtyard, perhaps a small fountain. This is already far better than the single-room dwellings most people inhabited. The house would be furnished with carpets, cushions, oil lamps, perhaps some decorative items. Not palace luxury, but considerable comfort. Food would be plentiful and varied. Not the bread and dates diet of the poor, but meat several times a week, fresh fruits and vegetables in season, sweets on special occasions, perhaps imported spices if the household had sufficient means. The scholar wouldn't be cooking this himself. He'd have a wife and perhaps servants handling food preparation. He'd eat sitting comfortably, likely using his right hand to eat from a shared platter in the traditional manner, but doing so in pleasant surroundings with sufficient food and no worry about whether there would be enough tomorrow. Clothing would be of good quality. The scholar would dress in a way that signaled his status. Clean robes, perhaps made of finer fabric than what common people could afford, maybe a distinctive turban style that indicated his scholarly position. Not ostentatious display, which would be religiously inappropriate, but clear markers of respectability and status. He would own books, or at least have access to them through institutional libraries or private collections. In an era when a single manuscript might cost as much as a house, book ownership was serious wealth. The scholar's library might contain works of Quranic exegesis, hadith collections, legal texts, perhaps some philosophy or medicine, if his interests extended that direction. These weren't just practical tools, but also status symbols, physical evidence of learning and resources. The scholar's daily schedule, while structured around the 5 prayers like everyone else's, had far more flexibility than manual laborers enjoyed. He might spend the morning teaching, the afternoon reading and writing, the evening in discussion with other scholars, or in attendance at a patron's social gathering. This was mentally demanding work, certainly, but it allowed for breaks, for variety, for choosing when to focus intensely and when to rest. Compare this to the farmer who worked dawn to dusk during planting and harvest seasons, whose schedule was dictated by weather and crop needs, who had no choice about when to rest because the work simply had to be done. Or the craftsman who needed to complete commissions to earn income, who couldn't decide to take a day off for reading without losing money his family needed. Or the merchant who had to be at the market when customers were there, who couldn't retreat to comfortable study when he felt like it. The scholar had something precious, a degree of control over his own time. Not complete freedom, he had obligations, appointments, duties, but far more autonomy than most people enjoyed. He could decide to spend an afternoon deep in a difficult philosophical text. He could choose to write when inspiration struck. He could adjust his schedule around his intellectual energy patterns rather than being enslaved to external demands. This autonomy extended to intellectual life as well. The scholar, once established, had significant freedom to pursue questions that interested him, write on topics he found important, develop arguments according to his own reasoning. Yes, there were boundaries. Certain positions were dangerous, certain topics were sensitive, certain arguments could bring trouble from religious authorities or political powers. But within those boundaries, there was remarkable intellectual space. The scholarly debates of medieval Islamic civilization covered an astonishing range. The nature of divine attributes, whether the Quran was created or eternal, whether human beings had free will or were predetermined, how to reconcile reason and revelation, what legal methodologies were most valid. These weren't just academic exercises, but had real-world implications for how Muslims understood their faith and lived their lives. Engaging in these debates required leisure and security. A farmer struggling to survive couldn't spend months developing a sophisticated argument about theological fine points. But a supported scholar could, and the best scholars did, producing works of remarkable subtlety and depth that still reward careful study today. The madrasa system, particularly as it developed from the 11th century onward, institutionalized this scholarly comfort. A student at a well-endowed madrasa received free education, often free room and board, sometimes even a small stipend. This was revolutionary. It meant that talented students from modest backgrounds could receive advanced education without their families having to support them through years of study. Of course, this generosity wasn't purely altruistic. The endowments were established by wealthy donors seeking religious merit. The madrasas trained scholars who would then staff mosques, courts, and government positions, maintaining the religious and social systems that legitimized wealth inequality and political authority. The system provided opportunity for some while ultimately serving elite interests. But from the individual student's perspective, it was an extraordinary chance. If you were a bright boy from a modest family, getting accepted to a prestigious madrasa meant escaping manual labor forever. It meant years of education in comfortable surroundings, studying with renowned teachers, accessing excellent libraries, making connections with other students who might later be influential. It meant transforming your entire life trajectory and your family's status. The curriculum was demanding, certainly. Students spent years memorizing texts, attending lectures, participating in debates, writing commentaries. The pedagogy emphasized memorization and oral disputation in ways that feel foreign to modern education. But the students weren't simultaneously working in fields or shops. Their full-time job was learning, supported by endowment income. They studied in buildings specifically designed for educational purposes, often beautiful structures, with courtyards, fountains, designated study areas. The living conditions weren't luxurious. Students typically shared small rooms, ate simple communal meals, but they were secure and adequate. Nobody went hungry. Nobody worried about finding shelter. The focus could be entirely on learning. Successful graduates could expect comfortable positions. They'd join the ranks of religious scholars, finding employment as teachers, judges, preachers, legal consultants, or advisors. They'd likely marry into respectable families, establish households that provided their children with similar educational advantages, perpetuating a cycle of scholarly status across generations. The contrast with non-scholarly routes through life was stark. The successful scholar at age 40 might be teaching in a comfortable madrasa, living in a decent house, respected in his community, with resources to support his family and educate his children. The farmer at 40, if he'd survived to 40, might be worn down by decades of physical labor, facing an uncertain future dependent on harvests and weather, worried about whether his children would have enough to eat. This doesn't mean scholars had easy lives without stress. They faced different pressures: the need to maintain reputations, navigate political and religious factionalism, avoid dangerous intellectual positions, compete for limited, prestigious positions, produce work that would be respected by peers. A scholar who lost his position or reputation might have few practical skills to fall back on. Studying theology doesn't prepare you for plowing fields, and there were risks specific to being a religious scholar. If your legal opinions or theological positions offended powerful people, you might face persecution. Several famous scholars were imprisoned, exiled, or even executed for their views. The relationship between religious authority and political power was never entirely stable. Scholars who miscalculated could pay serious prices. Still, on balance, the successful scholar's life was enviably comfortable compared to most people's experience, and this created certain ironies and tensions within Islamic society. Islam preached equality before God. The most famous hadith on the subject states that an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor does a non-Arab have superiority over an Arab. Neither does a white have superiority over a black, nor a black over a white, except by piety and good action. The Quran emphasizes that all humans are equal in God's sight, distinguished only by their righteousness, not by wealth or status. Yet here was a class of religious professionals living notably better than most believers, their comfort derived from their religious knowledge and positions. They preached humility while accepting deference. They taught that worldly wealth was temporary and meaningless. While enjoying comfortable homes and good food, they emphasized that all Muslims were brothers equal before God, while clearly occupying a higher social stratum. This contradiction wasn't lost on medieval Muslims. There's a rich tradition of criticism aimed at scholars who were seen as too worldly, too comfortable, too compromised by their dependence on patronage and political power. Sufi mystics particularly leveled such criticisms, arguing that true spirituality required renouncing worldly comfort and status. Some scholars took this criticism seriously and chose ascetic lifestyles despite having access to comfort. They refused lucrative positions, lived simply, avoided association with political power. These scholars were revered precisely because they chose hardship when they could have chosen ease, demonstrating that their religious commitment transcended self-interest. But most scholars, being human, chose comfort when it was available. They rationalized this in various ways. They needed resources to pursue scholarship effectively. They had families to support. Accepting patronage allowed them to serve the community better. There was no religious requirement to voluntarily impoverish oneself. All valid arguments, and all conveniently aligned with self-interest. The most successful scholars became quite skilled at walking this line, maintaining enough piety and ascetic credentials to be respected, while also enjoying the benefits of their positions. They dressed well, but not ostentatiously. They lived comfortably, but not luxuriously by elite standards. They associated with the wealthy and powerful, while also maintaining connections to common believers. They preached otherworldliness, while managing their worldly affairs quite competently. This balancing act required constant attention. A scholar who became too openly comfortable, too obviously wealthy, too closely identified with political power, risked losing religious credibility. But a scholar who was too critical of wealth and power risked losing patronage and position. The sweet spot was to appear pious and principled, while not being so difficult that patrons decided you were more trouble than you were worth. Some scholars navigated this perfectly, maintaining respected positions for decades, dying surrounded by students and admirers, leaving behind substantial scholarly legacies and comfortable inheritances for their children. Others miscalculated, pushed too hard against power, made enemies in the wrong places, chose principles over pragmatism at crucial moments, and paid for it with loss of position, exile, or worse. And throughout all of this, 5 times daily, these scholars stopped their comfortable activities to perform the same prayers as the poorest laborer. They prostrated themselves before God in exactly the same physical posture as the farmer, the porter, the street sweeper. For those moments, the hierarchy dissolved. The scholar's forehead touched the same ground as everyone else's. His body assumed the same posture of submission. His recitation followed the same prescribed words. Whether this ritual equality compensated for daily inequality is debatable. The prayer might remind everyone that status was temporary and meaningless before God. Or it might simply be a 5 times daily performance that everyone went through before returning to their distinctly unequal material circumstances. Probably different people experienced it differently. For some scholars, the prayer was genuinely humbling, a reminder that all their learning and status meant nothing ultimately, that death would erase all distinctions, that God's judgment would be based on righteousness, not reputation. For others, it was probably just habit, ritual performed competently but without deep reflection, something you did because you'd always done it, and everyone expected it. The same variety likely applied to Ramadan fasting. The wealthy scholar and the poor laborer both abstained from food during daylight hours, creating a temporary equality of hunger. But when sunset arrived, they broke their fasts very differently. The scholar might enjoy a substantial iftar meal with family and perhaps guests, eating well-prepared food with variety and abundance. The laborer might break his fast with dates and water, and a simple meal that wasn't that different from what he ate the rest of the year, except that he'd been forced to wait for it all day. Still, there was something powerful in the shared experience, however unequal its material dimensions. For that month, everyone was hungry together during the day. Everyone understood what the others were experiencing. The scholar couldn't eat in secret without being caught and shamed. The solidarity of suffering, however briefly it lasted, and however unevenly it was experienced, created genuine community. Perhaps that's the most we can say, that the religious structure of Islamic life created moments and contexts where inequality was briefly suspended or softened, where the scholar and the laborer shared something real, despite their very different daily circumstances. Whether those moments justified or compensated for the inequality the rest of the time is a question each person would have to answer for themselves. As you lie here in comfortable darkness, perhaps you recognize something familiar in this medieval pattern. We, too, have a class of knowledge workers, academics, lawyers, doctors, consultants, people who work primarily with their minds rather than their bodies. We, too, generally compensate intellectual labor more generously than physical labor. We, too, have scholarship funded by endowments, prestigious institutions that provide comfortable conditions for study, networks that perpetuate across generations. The specific mechanisms differ. We don't have quite the same patronage system, though grant funding and institutional politics aren't entirely dissimilar. But the fundamental pattern remains. Knowledge is valuable. Those who possess it can exchange it for comfort and status. And society creates structures that support people in pursuing knowledge, while many others do the physical work that keeps society functioning. Perhaps this is inevitable. Perhaps knowledge work genuinely requires the kind of time and security that only comes with material support. Perhaps it's not realistic to expect people to advance human understanding while simultaneously worrying about their next meal or whether they can afford shelter. Or perhaps we should be more critical, more aware of how knowledge systems can serve elite interests, how intellectual work can become divorced from common needs, how scholars can become more concerned with impressing each other and maintaining positions than with serving truth or community. The medieval Islamic scholarly class faced these questions and answered them in various ways. Some scholars were genuinely committed to serving their communities and used their positions to advance justice and learning. Others were primarily concerned with their own comfort and status, using religious knowledge as a means to worldly ends. Most, probably, were somewhere in between, mixing genuine conviction with human self-interest, serving God and themselves simultaneously in the messy way humans always do. And through it all, 5 times a day, they stopped to pray, washed their hands and faces and feet, stood and bowed and prostrated, performed the same physical motions as every other Muslim, rich or poor, learned or illiterate, powerful or powerless. For those moments, maybe the distinctions didn't matter, or maybe they mattered even more. The contrast between ritual equality and material inequality, made sharp by repetition. But the scholars, in any case, returned from prayer to comfortable homes and interesting books and the respect of communities. They lived good lives, measured by the standards of their time. They ate well. They slept in comfortable beds. They didn't break their backs with physical labor. They used their minds instead of their muscles, and society rewarded this with status and security. If you'd had the choice, and most people didn't, between being a scholar or a laborer in medieval Islamic society, the choice would have been obvious. Study hard, memorize the Quran, learn Arabic grammar, master enough jurisprudence to be useful, find patronage, secure a position, live comfortably, or fail to secure such opportunities and spend your life hauling, plowing, building, sweating, aching, wondering if there would be enough food, hoping your children might somehow have better chances. The scholars who made it, who became quadas and professors and court advisors, were the lucky ones. Not just intellectually gifted, though that helped, but lucky in their circumstances, their family backgrounds, their connections, their timing. Talent alone wasn't enough. Never has been. So perhaps we shouldn't judge them too harshly for enjoying the comfort their knowledge brought them. They played the game according to the rules of their time, converted learning into security, maintained religious respectability while avoiding poverty. They prayed 5 times daily, after all. They fasted during Ramadan. They followed the rules, even while benefiting from a system that rewarded them far more than it rewarded most believers. And maybe that's enough. Maybe we can't expect more than that. People doing their jobs competently, maintaining the traditions and knowledge of their culture, living as comfortably as their circumstances allow, without being complete hypocrites about it. The medieval Islamic scholarly class preserved an advanced knowledge that would have been lost otherwise. They trained generations of students. They wrote books that we still read. They maintained institutions that survived political chaos and military disasters. They did this while living better than most of their contemporaries, which is, when you think about it, pretty much how knowledge work has always functioned in human society. The lucky few study. The many others work with their hands. Both pray 5 times daily, pretending for those moments that the distinction doesn't exist. And then everyone returns to their actual lives, which remain stubbornly unequal, despite the prayer's egalitarian theology, as it was in medieval Baghdad, as it is now, as it probably always will be, human nature being what it is, and social systems organizing themselves as they do. But that's heavy thinking for bedtime. Let it drift away. Let the medieval scholars fade back into their comfortable homes and interesting disputes and regular prayer schedules. Let the whole medieval Islamic world, with its structure and obligations and inequalities and achievements, blur into the general past where it belongs. You're here now in your own time with your own comforts and challenges. You've traveled far tonight, across centuries and cultures, examining lives very different from your own. Tomorrow, you can think about what it all means, if anything. Tonight, just rest. The prayers are done. The fast is broken. The books are written and copied and preserved. Everything that needed doing is done. Sleep now. And so we return, gently, to the present moment, to your comfortable bed, your climate-controlled room, your freedom from obligation. The medieval Islamic world, with all its structure and discipline and inequality and achievement, fades back into history where it belongs. What have we learned from this journey? Perhaps nothing profound. Perhaps just that human beings have always found ways to organize their lives around belief systems, create hierarchies even when preaching equality, and struggle to balance spiritual ideals with material desires. Nothing specific to Islam or to the medieval period, just the human condition, expressed through particular cultural forms. Or perhaps we've learned something about discipline and its possibilities, that people once managed extraordinary achievements while maintaining religious obligations that would exhaust most modern people. That structure, even very demanding structure, can enable rather than prevent accomplishment. That our ancestors weren't superhuman, just differently situated, facing different challenges with different resources. Or perhaps we've learned about knowledge and its fragility, that centuries of intellectual work can be threatened by political chaos and military invasion, that preservation requires constant effort, copying and recopying, distributing across multiple locations, maintaining institutions and traditions that outlast individual lives, that we owe our own knowledge to people who did this work in the past, often under difficult circumstances, Or perhaps there's no lesson at all. Perhaps this has just been an extended lullaby, words washing over you like waves, detailed enough to be interesting if you're awake, but gentle enough to allow drifting if you're tired. History as bedtime story. The past as a comfortable darkness where you can rest your modern mind. The Abbasid caliphs are long dead. The House of Wisdom, if it existed, is long destroyed. Ibn Sina's stomach pains are long resolved. The scholars who enjoyed comfortable lives have returned to the dust they always knew awaited them. The prayer calls that structured their days have been silent for centuries. What remains are echoes, ideas preserved in books, traditions evolved and transformed, influences that shaped later civilizations, the decimal system you use daily, the algebra you struggled with in school, the medical knowledge that keeps you alive, all ultimately traceable in part to that medieval Islamic intellectual culture that flourished briefly and then declined, leaving behind fragments for us to piece together and ponder. But pondering is work for daylight. Right now, there's only this moment, this breath, this comfortable darkness, this release from obligation. You don't have to wake before dawn tomorrow. You don't have to perform ritual ablution 5 times. You don't have to fast for a month. You don't have to memorize anything in classical Arabic. You don't have to navigate patronage networks or court politics or theological disputes. You just have to rest. Let the medieval world recede. Let the details blur. Let the contrasts between then and now dissolve into irrelevance. You're here. You're safe. You're comfortable. And unlike our friends in medieval Baghdad or Cairo or Cordoba or Bukhara, you have nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do, no prayers awaiting you in the darkness before dawn. The adhan won't sound for you. The Ramadan fast won't arrive. The 5 daily obligations won't structure your hours. You're free of all that. Living in a time and place where religious practice is optional, where daily schedules are largely self-determined, where comfort is easily available. Lucky you, astonishingly, improbably lucky compared to most humans who have ever lived. Rest in that luck. Let it hold you. Let the privilege of your particular moment in history cradle you toward sleep. The medieval Islamic world managed extraordinary things under extraordinary constraints. You don't have to match them. You don't have to compete with Ibn Sina's productivity, or maintain the daily prayer schedule, or fast during summer heat. You just have to be here, now, in this soft darkness, letting go of everything except the simple fact of your own breathing. In, out, in, out. The rhythm continues without effort. The ancient rhythm, the same breathing that sustained Ibn Sina and the scholars and the farmers and the merchants and every human who has ever lived. We're all the same in that most basic way, however much our circumstances differ. Breathing, existing, eventually sleeping, and after sleep, waking to whatever tomorrow brings. But tomorrow is impossibly far away right now. There's only this moment extending peacefully in all directions. Stay here. Stay in this gentle present. Let the past recede completely. Let the future remain unformed. There's only now, only breath, only the soft weight of blankets and the comfortable darkness and the permission to simply be. No prayers to perform, no knowledge to preserve, no structure to maintain, no civilization to build or defend or mourn. Just breath, just rest, just the ancient human practice of sleeping when tired, the simplest and most profound gift. The medieval world is gone, its discipline and achievements and inequalities and faith all dissolved into history. What remains is just you, here, now, in your own moment, with your own simple needs. And the most pressing need right now is sleep. So sleep. The story is told. The journey is complete. The historical tour has ended. Rest now, time traveler. Rest well. The past can wait. It's been waiting this long already. It will wait until morning. And morning is so very, very far away. Sleep